Well, viewers, it was certainly an eventful night. Let's get right into it. It's really quite hard to overstate just how large this overnight assault has been. We're talking about what is effectively one of the biggest single waves of Russian attack in terms of volume in many weeks. So let me run through with you some of the very latest details here. First and foremost, where did these strikes occur? Right across Ukraine. Now, Russia fired missiles and drones from a number of different directions. It really seems like they wanted to target every corner of this country, and we saw attacks on, for instance, the capital of Kyiv, but also on the western city of Lviv, which is far from the front lines, really quite some distance away. Also, we saw strikes on the central city of Kryvyi Rih, but also on Mykolaiv down to the south. And then we saw even strikes on Kharkiv up in the northeast, so again, hitting every corner, really. But in terms of the specifics, what were these attacks targeting? Well, we heard from the Ukrainian Interior Ministry. They said that the strikes have targeted both energy infrastructure and also private residential buildings. We've got some harrowing footage from the city of Kryvyi Rih. You can see there the aftermath of one of the Russian missile strikes, very badly damaged apartment block. The windows blown out, the balconies collapsed. There are reports of people being trapped under the rubble. Sadly, we do have reports now of civilian casualties in that area. I don't have exact figures, but they are running into the dozens, I believe, at least 30 confirmed civilian fatalities. But bear in mind, those numbers will rise. That is sadly inevitable. But another area that was heavily struck was the energy infrastructure. And what you will notice from all of the footage from the various locations where there's been these strikes is the power cuts are absolutely widespread. This was a deliberate strategy by the Russian forces, I would say, because this is a large-scale assault. It was not a one-off or something that came out of nowhere. They clearly planned this operation for some time, and it seems to me that they want to cause as much damage as possible to the energy infrastructure. When you look at a map of the affected regions, you can see the vast swaths of Ukraine that are without electricity. You know, we're talking about millions of people who are facing blackouts, including in the capital of Kyiv. Now, I should also say that although it appears that most of these strikes have occurred overnight, there are some reports of Russian activity continuing still. There are ongoing drone strikes, so the situation remains very serious indeed. In terms of the response from the Ukrainian side, well, first and foremost, let's start with the air defenses. Because according to the Ukrainian authorities, they managed to intercept 41 out of the 55 missiles fired by the Russian forces, and also 32 out of the 36 Iranian-made Shahed drones. That's according to the Ukrainian Interior Ministry. So they claim a success rate of well over 70%. And actually, if you look at the footage, that seems broadly to add up. Many of the missiles and drones that you can see flying across the sky, they're not on fire. That means that they were probably shot down. So yes, Ukraine's air defense is certainly working at a high rate of efficiency. However, tragically, some of the other missiles and drones did get through, and it caused heavy damage. And again, I think when you look at some of the footage, that does seem to be broadly in line. If you take, for instance, this footage from the capital, Kyiv, where you can see the aftermath of a Russian strike. Now, we don't know exactly what it was that hit that particular location. It could have been a drone or a missile. But either way, again, this is the sort of damage that you would expect from a successful strike. Same thing here. You can see the windows blown out, the facade of the building damaged. So, what you have to say is that while Ukraine's air defenses performed relatively well, there were still some notable successes by the Russian forces in terms of getting their weapons through. Okay, and before we move on, guys, just a quick note. If you want to continue to follow the conversation, I'd encourage you to join our channels, the links for which are provided below. Now, in terms of the wider political context, what is the significance of this large-scale assault? And I think we can break this down into two elements. The first is simply the desire by the Russian forces to cause as much damage as possible, to cause maximum destruction within Ukraine. It's not just about trying to cripple the energy infrastructure. It's also about trying to cause damage to residential areas, which again, I think points towards a desire to undermine public morale. And we've heard a lot in recent weeks about how the Russian forces are trying to step up their attacks and that they want to achieve more on the battlefield. This is part of that drive. I would also say it's not only about achieving success and inflicting damage, but it's also about imposing a very high cost on the Ukrainians. So whether or not Russia is able to achieve its military objectives doesn't really matter. What matters is that they impose a very high cost on the Ukrainians, and they're saying, look, every single day that passes, every single day that this war continues, we are going to make sure that we inflict damage on your country. The second element of this is that it really does seem like the Russian forces are trying to cripple Ukraine's energy grid ahead of winter. As you know, temperatures in Ukraine can drop well below freezing, and the population needs energy to stay warm. Well, the Russian forces are saying, look, if we can't win on the battlefield, if we can't make territorial gains, then we will try and make the lives of the ordinary Ukrainian people as difficult as possible. Now, we've seen in recent weeks, actually, prior to this major assault that Ukraine has been carrying out, the Russian forces have been stepping up their attacks. In particular, we've seen them focus on the energy infrastructure. Now, you might recall that back in late October, we had this major incident near the city of Kharkiv, where a Russian strike destroyed several energy pylons, and that caused a power cut across large parts of Ukraine. It was later restored, but again, that was the same strategy. And when you look at some of the statements coming out of the Kremlin, the language being used by the Russian authorities, this is all part of a deliberate plan to make things difficult for Ukraine ahead of winter. Okay, so that's the first point. In terms of the second point, what has been the international reaction? Well, pretty much what you would expect. We had the G7 foreign ministers issuing a joint statement. They condemned what they called Russia's barbaric mass missile attacks, and they pledged continued military and financial support for Ukraine. And that's really the key message here. I would say that Russia would like nothing more than for the West to sit down at the negotiating table. What the West has said consistently is that, no, we are not going to sit down while Russia continues to occupy Ukrainian territory. And also, we're not going to dictate to Ukraine what it should accept at the negotiating table, so the West will continue to support Ukraine militarily and financially. What's interesting here, though, is that this latest assault by the Russian forces may be designed to change the calculus. What Russia is saying, look, if you continue to support Ukraine, then these are the sorts of attacks that you can expect. We're willing to cause massive civilian casualties. We're willing to cause damage across every region of this country. And that's basically a message to the West, a warning. But it doesn't seem to have worked because the response from the US and the UK has been unwavering. They're going to continue to support Ukraine. The other question, of course, is why now? Why did the Russian forces launch this latest assault now? I mean, they've carried out large attacks before, but generally speaking, they tend to come after periods of low activity. And that's certainly been the case here. We had a couple of months where the strikes were relatively limited in scale, and then suddenly last night, a major assault. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the Russian forces are seeking to increase the pressure on the front lines. You know, they've been unable to make any real progress, but what they are doing is massing troops and equipment, and we're starting to see more and more fighting along the front line. So I think this is part of a drive to step up the attacks and also to create a sense of momentum. Whether or not they succeed in doing so remains to be seen. But that's certainly the intention. And my fear is that we're entering into a new and even more dangerous and unpredictable phase of this conflict. Okay? Thank you so much for watching. I'm afraid it's likely to be one of many updates today, so do join us again soon. Thank you again for watching.